Hello everyone, this is the Introverted Astrologer and I'm back with you again after a short break. And whilst I've been absent, I've been taking a look at the riveting dynasty that is the Kennedy family, America's political family. So what I'm doing now is pulling together a composite. I'm looking at a few members of the Kennedy family through the generations, and we'll be looking out for those repeating themes. Are there indications of fame and wealth in these charts? What does a chart look like at a time of tragedy or assassination? Is there a curse on the Kennedy family with these multitude of deaths, assassinations, infant deaths and disability? The myth of a Kennedy curse has been investigated by other astrologers too. So we'll look at that. And as I conclude this video, we will bring back in the chart of JFK Jr, who's running as an independent in this year's US elections. We'll see if any of the other charts can help us identify a slightly more accurate birth time. So let's kick off now with a look at the chart of Joseph P. Kennedy Senior, father to many Kennedys, including Bobby and JFK. This was a man with very strong political ambitions of his own. He was also generally ambitious and amassed a fortune in his time. And what we are doing here we are trying to identify common themes that we can then take down the family line and see which factors tend to repeat. It will be beyond the scope of this video to do a detailed analysis of each chart. We are simply looking for those strong repeating themes and aspects. So we can see this heavy Virgo influence in the 12th house with a Sun-Moon conjunction. Mercury and Venus are nearby too and drawing closer to the ascendant, so particularly in the case of Venus, her position is strengthened, despite the fact that she wouldn't normally be happy in the sign of Virgo. We have that Libra ascendant. The moon is in a decent conjunction there with Mercury, so Moon-Mercury aspects are going to be something we'll keep our eyes on. Because of all that 12th house influence, we could ask ourselves whether we're seeing overtones already of service to the collective. And of course there is also strong personal ambition, which we can see by that Jupiter-Mars conjunction in the second house of our assets. And might we sometimes see a certain ruthlessness or dishonesty with that opposition to Pluto and Neptune? Possibly so. Individuals with Jupiter-Mars may often come across as being extremely lucky, but what is actually happening is that there is intense determination there, and actions and goals benefit from Jupiter's wisdom to judge the moment very well, to see the full picture, to strike out optimistically and get what we want. And let's also look at that North Node. Here it is in the sign of Cancer and in the 10th house. The 10th house overtures will be stronger than Cancerian themes because of the slow speed with which the node moves. We're going to be bringing up this Cancer-Capricorn axis frequently during this video, so it's important that we pay attention to it here at the start. The node in the 10th house and in the sign of Cancer implies that career is extremely important during this lifetime, and that possibly care and compassion, nurturing, are brought forward into our public face. That Chiron on the midheaven repeats this theme, and we could also view it as allowing an escape for the Sun and Moon in the 12th house by that smooth sextile aspect. We're now going to move on and take a look at the chart of John Kennedy, JFK. JFK was the second of Joseph's children and the second son. He was born in 1917, and by the time he was elected President of the United States, it was November 1960, and he was the youngest president to have ever been elected in US history at that time. His tragic assassination in 1963 shook the world, but let's have a quick look and see if we can identify some of those planetary energies and aspects playing out. We can again see that we have a Venus-ruled ascendant, Libra like his father, and the ruler of that ascendant is placed in the sign of Gemini, again giving a dollop of mutable energy. His moon is placed in Virgo and in fact is very close to his father's own natal moon. We can see here a wide sun-moon square, repeating the theme of his father's chart where sun and moon are contacting each other. We can again find that Mars and Jupiter are conjuncting each other, although this time it isn't in the second house, but has flipped to the corresponding sign of Taurus, and in the 8th house of other people's money, and also of crisis, of intensity and transformation. I'm using the Placidus house system here, but we could note that that moon would actually be in the 12th house if we were using whole sign houses. But we also need to pay attention to that North Node again, because this time it has flipped signs from the Cancer that we saw in Joe Senior's chart and is now in Capricorn. And if we were using whole signs, it would be in his 4th house. But we can pick up anyway that Cancer and Capricorn and the midheaven IC axis are heavily accentuated here. Saturn on the midheaven is symbolic of that keen, burning ambition. Saturn is opposite its natural home, which is Capricorn, down there on the IC. But nonetheless, it is strengthened by being on the MC and raises the question of whether JFK brought qualities of nurturing or caring to his public role, and reinforced by that trine to Chiron in his 6th house. The Moon and Mercury are again in aspect, so we can see that ability to be articulate, to be mentally versatile and quick-moving. Venus, the chart ruler, is actually in mutual reception with Mercury, given that they are in each other's signs. And coupled with that polished Libra ascendant, we can see that we would have an individual of considerable charm, someone of diplomacy and intelligence. We can identify threads of service here by that moon in its Virgo placement, and potentially also by that Neptune on the midheaven with Saturn. Are we a vehicle by which our career is able to bring into concrete form, via Saturn, the Neptunian needs of the collective? We'll have a quick look now at the birth chart of Bobby Kennedy, also known as RFK. He was born in 1925, a few years after JFK. He was a lawyer and a politician, and he was indeed the United States General Attorney between the years of 1961 and 1964. He also became a senator, and at the time of his assassination, he was running for the Democratic presidential nomination. I'm sure you can see that uncanny repetition of planets in the signs of Cancer and Capricorn on the midheaven or at the IC. This is becoming a really strong family theme. Once again, that node is in the 4th house, in Cancer this time. And yet again, that Venus-ruled ascendant is popping up, this time in the sign of Taurus. There are overtones of 8th house or Scorpio energy between these two brothers' charts. In this case, we have a heavy dollop of Scorpio on the 7th house, or the descendant. That Scorpio Mars would be the ruler of the 12th house, where we're using a whole sign system. And again, we can see Sun-Moon contacts, implying a singularity of purpose. We can also see Moon-Mars contacts via a square. Like his father and brother, RFK has an Earth Moon, and there is a flavour of early emotional needs being subjugated or unacknowledged in preparation for adult public life, where they can be given expression through highly responsible and respectable public roles. There is potentially a streak of ruthlessness here with that Pluto on the IC, opposing part of that Capricorn stellium. Once again, a preponderance of planets are in cardinal or fixed signs, with a splattering of mutable energy. If we place the two brothers' charts side by side, can we identify some common elements? Of course, they have that Venus-ruled ascendant which they share with their father. There's also that striking Cancer-Capricorn 4th, 10th house emphasis. Like our father, we both have an Earth-Moon. There is also a strong streak of 8th house or Scorpio placements. We also share Sun-Moon aspects. The node, symbolic of life purpose, repeatedly crops up in either Cancer or Capricorn, the 4th or the 10th. Moon and Mars are drawn together in both charts, perhaps signifying an action-orientated outlook, clear expression between the emotions and the will. And naturally, we could also find it easy to act for ourselves and to act out our own will and aim towards fulfilling our own emotional needs. Let's have a quick look at the charts of these two brothers and their father and see whether there were any conjunctions by fixed stars to important points. These were, after all, famous men, and they rose to positions of eminence. In the case of JFK, he was the United States President, but all of the men enjoyed success in their own lives, in their own right. So we'll pay particular attention to fixed stars which aspect the sun, the moon, the chart ruler, or the angles by conjunction with very close orbs. Joseph Senior did not actually have any of the main fixed stars associated with wealth and success, aspecting these personal points I've outlined. RFK had Rukbat, a fixed star associated with wealth, closely conjuncting that cluster of planets around his midheaven. It's close to the MC and not too far away from that Venus, the chart ruler. And John Kennedy had Pollux at his midheaven, bestowing power and a penetrative mind, but potentially violence too. And Venus, his chart ruler, is conjunct Rigel. We could expect wealth, a rise in life, a man of action, and very strong willpower. And finally, JFK's sun is close to Aldebaran, which is considered to be one of the luckiest stars for wealth and success. What we're going to do now is take a look at the charts of JFK and RFK at the time of their tragic assassinations. If we are to identify whether a curse is afflicting this family, in some way this would show up by transit, progression, solar arc, perhaps in the solar return charts. So we're going to start with JFK. He was assassinated on the 22nd of November 1963 and passed away that day. And here we have his progressions and his solar arc around the outside of his natal chart. We've been given a birth time of 3 p.m. for JFK, but please bear in mind that this is from memory and it's very likely that we are at least a few minutes out. What we can see is that his progressed sun is nearing a conjunction to that natal MC. Sun midheaven conjunctions indicate that we are literally shining out to the world through our midheaven. And this could well be something that actually happened when he was inaugurated just over 2 years previously. But whichever way you look at it, whether you are United States President or a president who's assassinated, that cements any claim to fame. And this man is assured his place in our history books all over the world. His solar arc midheaven is also square to his natal sun. If we look at that solar arc Mars, it's nearing a conjunction with his natal Pluto. This kind of combination does make us think of violence, of extreme force, of brutality, and of indefatigable determination and will. His solar arc vertex is also approaching a conjunction with that natal Pluto. Although one wouldn't take this aspect to be symbolic of death in and of itself, it is adding further footnotes to what was a violent and sudden incident. We can also take note of that solar arc Neptune is within minutes of exact in a conjunction with his natal moon. It signifies potential blurring of boundaries and reality. It could indicate confusion. Our emotional perception is potentially distorted, and we could even be being deceived. We're unlikely to appreciate the circumstances and people around us with the clarity that we need. We'll make a quick note of these aspects and move on to take a look at the transits around JFK on that day. And here we're looking at the transits of the day. These are displayed around JFK's natal chart. I think we can all see the loose outline of a T-square forming between different groups of planets and that 8th house Taurus Gemini energy. But let's pick it apart. One of the transits that JFK was undergoing that year was that Saturn had begun squaring his natal Mars earlier in March, and that by retrograde motion, Saturn had turned back and then begun moving forward to make a final hit on that natal Mars. So it was just over a degree away and bearing down hard. This is typically a transit when we feel blocked or frustrated. We may feel resentful or angry, but it's also a transit of force. At the time of death, transiting Uranus was just a few minutes away from his progressed MC, and the transiting North Node is exactly opposite its natal position. Again, similar to the vertex, this is not actually a transit that of itself would indicate end of life or violence. However, the vertex and the North Node often show up at critical moments or stressful times in our life. They can also show up when a very important person or event enters our life. They're like footnotes to important times rather than incidents in themselves. And let's go on to have a look at the solar return for JFK in that year. If we look at the standalone solar return on the left, it's immediately clear that this is going to be a very unusual year. We can see that through such strong planetary combinations on the angles or squaring the ascendant of the chart. There's a prominent grand square. The malefics are part of it. Uranus and Mars, which frequently feature around the time of accidents, shocks, violence, are up there, closely together on the MC. The implied force and shock of this are palpable. But we should never look at the solar return solely on its own. We need to consider it in relation to the natal chart. And so if we look to the chart on the right, JFK's natal chart is in the centre, the solar return planets placed in the outer ring. We can see that the descendant of the solar return is closely conjuncting his natal Mercury in Taurus, in his 8th house, and ruler of his 12th house. So we know that Mercury is very important this year. It's also very close to his vertex and his Mars in his natal 8th house stellium. So this cluster of planets is important this year. And this cluster also squares his natal Uranus. So we can see the amount of tension that is being brought into play during his 1963-1964 solar return. That solar return also has a Scorpio ascendant co-ruled by Mars. So we know that Mars is important. In fact, the huge power of that cluster of planets on the midheaven of the solar return, Mars, Uranus, Moon, Pluto, are all squaring his natal sun if you allow generous orbs, but certainly Pluto is more closely squaring that natal sun. And this implies, amongst other things, threat to life, power struggles, forced change. And again, we can pick up those Neptune aspects. Neptune in the solar return is very closely opposing Venus. It's also opposing Mercury. Rumours of affairs and unfaithfulness followed JFK, but leaving aside those issues, Neptune opposing Mercury would again obfuscate incoming data. Our mental acuity could be challenged. Were we seeing everything around us clearly? Potentially not. Now we're going to take a look at the chart of RFK. He was shot shortly after midnight at the Ambassador Hotel. He was taken to hospital where he died the next day. Can we pick up on the impending danger at this time in his progressions or his solar arcs? Again, let's bear in mind that the time of birth is given as 3:11 in the afternoon, but this again is from somebody's memory. So we need to allow for perhaps being a few minutes out. We can see that solar arc Uranus has rotated to the time when it is exactly opposing the Mars in Scorpio on his natal descendant. And the solar arc ascendant is moving into a position where it will exactly oppose that Mercury in his 8th house. This could be symbolic of the emphasis needed on mercurial skills and symbolisms at this point in time, because of course he is avidly campaigning, and so acuity and good communication skills are paramount. But it is also tripping off 8th house energy. And there we have solar arc Pluto coming up to square his natal Scorpio sun. It's just a few minutes away from being exact. So we're seeing this repeating theme of Mars, Uranus, Sun, Pluto, 8th house energy. We're repeating this theme across both of these brothers' charts around the time of their death. And what kind of transits were involved in the background for RFK? Now, transiting Pluto had opposed RFK's natal Uranus earlier that year, and at the time of death it was about 1.5 degrees away. But that same transiting Pluto was squaring his natal Mercury, and this was just a few minutes away from being exact at the time of his death. Now, Pluto square Mercury would show the considerable pressure that is being placed on RFK's powers of persuasion, his oratory, his need to transform people's opinions. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the 8th house is also being activated. The transiting Moon and Uranus are very close together, speaking of shock and disruption. And the transiting North Node is again in a prominent place in that it is closely squaring his natal midheaven, Venus nearby, and opposing the natal vertex. And if we just allow another degree of orb, we can factor in that natal Pluto. And here we have RFK's solar return chart for the time of his assassination. It isn't immediately as striking as was JFK's solar return, but we do see angular activity. Pluto, Uranus and Chiron are on the MC-IC axes. And the Moon, which is the ruler of the solar return, is tightly conjunct that ascendant. So let's see how this plays out against his natal chart. And we can see that Moon ascendant of the solar return is very nearby his natal Pluto, highlighting that Pluto-Venus opposition. The solar return Mars conjuncts his midheaven, bringing to life that Jupiter-Venus conjunction there on his natal midheaven. The solar midheaven is actually conjuncting his natal Uranus and squaring that natal 8th house Mercury. and the solar return ascendant is very close to his natal Pluto. So we would have an uneasy feeling about this year. The solar arcs and progressions would confirm this. So based on the birth charts and the assassination charts of these two men, would we consider that something deep, dark and mysterious was at play here? After all, these events are perfectly describable by the progressions, the solar arcs and the transits that we can see at this time. And the solar returns sum these up perfectly for us. Is a curse picking off members of this family one by one with statistical improbability? Eminent astrologer and psychologist Liz Green has had a look at this matter herself. She's looked into the charts of a few of the family members and paid particular attention to the 8th and the 12th house. Her work has been published on the Astrodienst website, and I'd like to read some of her closing comments here. When patterns from the past make us shape our futures compulsively, we will solve nothing by either passively anticipating disaster or believing ourselves to be exempt. Any individual with a powerful Pluto or an emphasis in the watery houses is the potential recipient of enormous power and insight, built on a profound comprehension of the past and the inner world. But there is no such thing as a free lunch, and one must find the courage to make the heartbreaking separation from the matrix of the family psyche in full consciousness, emerging as an individual, lonely, unique, and attuned to the needs of one's own soul. Now we're going to move on and pick up JFK Jr.'s chart. And again we can see that uncanny Cancer Capricorn echoing down the generations from what we have learned from his father, his uncle, and his grandfather. Will we be any closer to working out the part of the day in which he was most likely born? Because we simply have no birth time at present. The family inheritance of Scorpio energy is palpable here too. Birth charts are notoriously difficult to rectify if we have no likely time of the day in which a person was born. But we can do some work by honing in on the moon and the aspects it makes. These do often repeat down the generations. And to help us with this, we're going to look at the chart of RFK Jr, the father, with his son, RFK III. As you can see, the emphasis has shifted substantially in RFK III's chart, and we have more of a 6th house emphasis here. But if we hone in on that moon, look at the close degrees between the moon and Mars again, and this time Uranus too. And so if we turn back to RFK the father, we can see that that moon is in an aspect with Mars, although it's quite wide, at noon. If his birth time was any earlier, we would lose that aspect, and I feel sure he has it. And it is not improbable that his moon would also be in the wider region of Uranus. After all, this is a man whose family life and early nurturing was repeatedly interrupted by the assassination of his uncle and his father. I have come across some new information online about a likely birth time for RFK Jr, and so we'll take a look at this now. This information comes from an astrologer by the name of Jude Cowell. She's published it on her website, which is called Stars Over Washington. It's a political website, and she states on it that her data comes via another astrologer called Matthew Swan, and that the Kennedy family actually had an astrologer in the mid-1970s, and this is where the data comes from. So I'm going to take a chance and draw up his birth chart with the proposed time of 5:32 in the afternoon. And this is what the new birth chart would look like. We still have the water houses involved. The moon is still in a decent trine with Mars and is conjunct to Uranus in the 12th house. We know that RFK Jr. joined a 12-step program because of a heroin addiction. Is it unlikely then that we would find something in the 12th house? After all, the 12th house is a place where we can find alcoholism and opiate addiction, in that they are forms of release or escape that sedate the individual. Can we picture RFK in a more leonine slant? We do still retain planets strong on angles, and I've had a look at the progressions around the time of RFK the father's assassination. The progressed sun and moon are opposing each other at that time, suggesting a point of culmination and potentially crisis. And so I'll revisit RFK's chances at the 2024 election based on this new birth time and give it a go. We can also see that one of the early eclipses in 2024 will be conjunct his midheaven, as Jude Cowell points out in her article. The next video I'll be making will be taking a look at Kamala Harris over the next year or so. Until then, take very good care of yourselves, and God bless you and your families.